Continuing our study of Revelation chapter 1. Today we're going to be discussing verses 13 and 14 and focusing on the Son of Man, the one like a Son of Man, and the Ancient of Days. So I'm going to read verses 12 through 14 so we get a little bit of the context, as Revelation 1:13 just starts in the middle of a sentence here. So starting with verse 12, John says, "And I turned to see the voice that spoke with me, and having turned I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the lampstands was one like a Son of Man. He was dressed in a robe extending down to his feet, and he wore a wide golden belt around his chest. His head and hair were as white as wool, even as white as snow, and his eyes were like a fiery flame." So I want to mention just here as we get started that if you have not listened to the teaching that I did on the voice, the title was The Voice and Two Powers in Heaven, I would encourage you to go and listen to that one because we're going to be talking a lot in this study about the two powers in heaven. And while verses 13 and 14 I do believe are definitely two powers in heaven verses, especially when we go look at Daniel and Ezekiel, the two powers starts in verse 12 because the voice, as we talked about in that one, the voice is identified as the first power in heaven, and I gave verses throughout the Old Testament as to why that's the case. So again, if you haven't listened to that one, go listen to that. So the first thing that we're going to notice here in our study of verses 13 and 14 is that John says that in the midst of the lampstands was one like a Son of Man. So the lampstands are identified as the church. The church is, of course, made up of individuals. So in the midst of his people, John sees one like a Son of Man. And again, just to mention that other study, the voice, John turned to see the voice, but who he sees is Jesus. So it's again, that is the beginning of this two powers discussion. But what we see here is Jesus in the midst of the lampstands is indicating that Jesus is not absent during the trials of his people. He's right there in the midst with us during our sufferings and trials, as well as our successes and joys. Jesus is with us throughout our lives. "I will never leave you or forsake you," he said. So in the midst is one like a Son of Man. And we see this in the writings of Daniel and also Ezekiel, that John is getting this language from specifically from Daniel, and also myself and some scholars are going to suggest also that it's drawn from Ezekiel. So the first verse in Daniel that we're going to talk about is Daniel chapter 3 verse 25. In Daniel chapter 3 is when Daniel's 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to bow down to the statue that Nebuchadnezzar set up, and as a result of their faithfulness, they get thrown into the fiery furnace. So as Revelation is largely about suffering and trials, it's no coincidence that John links it right away to Daniel chapter 3. Because as we're going to see here, the language of "in the midst" is taken from Daniel 3:25 in the Greek. So Daniel 3:25, English translation of the Septuagint, says, and this is when Nebuchadnezzar has just thrown them into the fire, but he hops up in shock because he sees 4 men. It says, and the king said, "But I see 4 men loose and walking in the midst of the fire, and there has no harm happened to them. And the appearance of the 4th is like the Son of God." So it's the "in the midst" phrase that matches what John says in the midst of the lampstands. So it's in the midst of the fire in Daniel 3:25, and Jesus is there. The one like that Nebuchadnezzar says the appearance of the 4th is like the Son of God. I believe that is the same individual as the one like a Son of Man that Daniel's talking about, who is God. So he's right there in the midst of the fire. He's right there with us in the trials of life. The next thing that John links is Daniel 7:13, and that's the one like a Son of Man. Daniel 7:13 says, "Behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a Son of Man." And then the description where it talks about his head and hair being white as wool, that's taken from Daniel 7:9. It's the description of the Ancient of Days. And that says, "As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. There's also a link here to Daniel chapter 10, verses 5 and 6, but I'm going to save that for our next study, as we're going to do 2 studies on verses 13 and 14, and then the next one, we're going to focus more on Daniel chapter 10 and the description of Jesus as having eyes like fiery flame. And also we'll talk there about the clothing that he's described as wearing. But I believe there's also a connection here to Ezekiel chapter 1. Because in Ezekiel 1:26, Ezekiel says, "On the throne high above was someone who looked like a human." And Ezekiel identifies this one that looks like a human as the likeness of Yahweh's glory. So there's also a linkage between Daniel 7:13 and Ezekiel 1:26, as Ezekiel sees God in human form seated on a throne. In Daniel 7, specifically verse 9, talks about thrones. So we'll discuss that here in a little bit, this throne. Actually, you know what? We'll just discuss it right now. Because Daniel 7:9, Daniel says that there are thrones placed, multiple. And the Ancient of Days takes his seat in Daniel 7:9. But then in 7:13, Daniel sees one like a son of man coming. But Daniel only says that the Ancient of Days took his seat. He doesn't say that he saw the one like a son of man seated. But Ezekiel does see the human one seated on his throne. So I'm suggesting there's a connection there, that Daniel sees multiple thrones, but he sees the Ancient of Days seated. And Ezekiel is the one who sees the one like a son of man seated. So the one who's seated is God. The seated God is the Lord of the council. As Daniel 7 specifically says that the council is standing while the Ancient of Days is seated. And also this links with Psalm 82, when the psalmist asks God to arise and take back the nations. Well, to arise, he must have been seated previously. And this also reminds me of Jesus' words in Revelation 3:21, where it says, "I also conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne." So now we're going to discuss the Son of Man being described using Ancient of Days terminology, and this is where we'll really get into the 2 powers, and it's really interesting. It's really, really interesting stuff here. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about is 2 manuscripts of the Septuagint, known as Manuscript 88 and Manuscript 967. So David Aune here, I thought, had a really, really good discussion about this, so I'm going to be leaning on him for this section. So Aune says, quote, "While in the Masoretic text of Daniel 7:13, the one like a son of man is presented to the Ancient of Days, thus clearly distinguishing the 2 figures, here the one like a son of man is described as if he is identical with the Ancient of Days. This identification was not necessarily original with John, but may already be presupposed by the Septuagint version of Daniel 7:13 found in Manuscript 967. End quote. So now I'm going to read a translation of Manuscript 967, and then we'll get back to Aune's comments on it. So Manuscript 967, translated into English of course, says, "I was observing in a vision of the night, and behold, upon the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and as the Ancient of Days he came, and the bystanders approached him." So you'll see there right away the difference jumps out between the Masoretic and this version of the Septuagint, this Septuagint manuscript. Because, as Aune said, in the Masoretic, the one like a son of man is clearly differentiated from the Ancient of Days. But this Septuagint manuscript 967 and also manuscript 88, those 2 manuscripts have the Son of Man equated with the Ancient of Days. So when John is quoting here, when John is describing the one like a son of man using Ancient of Days terminology, he is not, as Aune said, he's not necessarily inventing that himself. That's not something that John, under inspiration, came up with for the first time, that he may be linking back to manuscript 967 and manuscript 88. In other words, these early fragments, these early Septuagint copies. So I have more to say about that and what it might have to do with our view of inspiration here in a little bit. But let's get back to Aune right now. Aune continues, he says, quote, "Manuscript 967 is one of the earliest extant copies of parts of the Septuagint. It identifies the one like a son of man with the Ancient of Days, though it is unclear whether this was an intentional or the result of scribal error, or whether this was pre-Christian or reflects Christian exegesis. Yet whether or not the identification of the Son of Man with the Ancient of Days reflected in manuscript 88 and 967 was intentional, it is clear that it could be understood that way. And Revelation 1:13 provides clear evidence that it was understood as referring to the Son of Man as identical with the Ancient of Days," end quote. So that's very interesting. Now, Aune does hedge it a little bit there, as scholars often do. He said that it's not clear whether that manuscript was intentionally written that way or whether it was the result of a scribal error. And I do have some comments from other scholars here about this momentarily. He's also saying that it's not clear whether that version of the Septuagint is pre-Christian or not. So he is hedging it a little bit, but it's very interesting either way. Now, Aune himself, he takes these Septuagint manuscripts and their usage by John in Revelation 1:13 he then goes and he uses that evidence to argue against the two powers in heaven. Aune is not a proponent of the two powers in heaven idea, but I myself am a proponent of two powers in heaven. So it's just interesting that he takes that to argue against two powers, and I'm going to take it to argue for two powers. Because I don't think Revelation 1:13 and 14 is evidence against the two powers. I think it's actually evidence for the two powers. Now, why do I say that? Because in the Old Testament, the authors would often blur the lines between the two powers. It often was not a crisp distinction. Now, a notable exception of this is Genesis 19:24, which says, Yahweh rained on Sodom and Gomorrah burning sulfur from Yahweh. So in that one, there's clearly two. But most of the time when the two powers are discussed, it's difficult to differentiate between them. That at times there are multiple Yahwehs present at the same time. Now, as we mentioned in the study of the voice, or as Dr. Heiser says, for those of you familiar with his work on this, that one Yahweh is invisible in heaven, and that's what in that one study we identified as the voice, while the other is visible in human form on earth. And they're oftentimes present at the same time. And we can see that from some grammatical clues and hints. So an example of this blurring of the powers here is one of my favorites. It's Genesis 48:15 and 16. And this is where Jacob has pronounced a blessing on the sons of Joseph. And he says, the God before whom my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all harm, may he bless these boys. Now notice God and the angel, and then the singular he. Now it also suggests that we could maybe even see a glimpse of what would become Trinitarian doctrine. Obviously, the Old Testament doesn't have a full-blown Trinitarian idea, but that's where we get the concept. The Jewish Godhead is visible right here. Now, it's often more in the binitarian sense, where the two powers, but right here, notice what Jacob said. The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked. That's one. The God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day. That's two. The angel who has redeemed me from all harm. That's three. Then Jacob's conclusion, may he bless these boys. So it's at minimum, I believe, a two powers, and possibly even three powers. What would become kind of one of the foundational... these ideas were the foundation that became Trinitarian doctrine in the Christian era. And this is standard operating procedure for the prophets to present the two powers without crisp lines of distinction. So John, being expert in the Old Testament and being the last in their line, would have been well aware of this descriptive tradition. So when he's blurring the lines of the two powers, he's operating within the tradition of the prophets of the Old Testament. So that's what I think is going on in Revelation 1, 13, and 14. But for people who are not fans of the two powers idea, then you have what David Aune said, where the Son of Man is presented as identical with the Ancient of Days. So either way, you have the deity of Christ. It's just, do you have it presented in two powers, the two powers idea, or not? Now, learning about manuscript 967, I thought it was just very interesting, because before manuscript 967 was discovered, scholars viewed manuscript 88 as reflecting an error. So manuscript 88 was known before manuscript 967. And so they believed that manuscript 88 reflected an error. They believed that the identification of one like a son of man with the Ancient of Days was an error. But they also recognized that John cited from this quote-unquote error in Revelation 1. So I thought that was really interesting. I have an example here from a scholar named Harris in 1921. He said, quote, "With the Christian apocalypse citing from Daniel and expressing the very marrow of this error, we must suppose that the apocalyptist read our error in his Septuagint text," end quote. So notice what he's saying here, that manuscript 88, that translation is an error, yet John was reading that quote-unquote error and he brought it into Revelation. So now this would get into one's view of inspiration, because my view of inspiration, I would not believe that John would bring an error into the book of Revelation. So because John, well, I guess it'd be better to say if John is citing this version of the Septuagint. Now it's possible that, as Aune said, it doesn't necessarily mean that John kind of came up with this under inspiration or was inspired for the first time to put this. It could be that he was familiar with these versions of the Septuagint, and that's what, as I said, this scholar Harris in 1921 thought. But it's possible that John, under inspiration, wasn't using these Septuagint versions. This is just how he described the two powers. But if he's citing this version of the Septuagint and he's under inspiration, as I definitely believe he was, then that in and of itself gives weight to this version of the Septuagint. As a scholar named Johann Lust says, and Lust is a proponent of reading these versions of the Septuagint as original. And he says, quote, "The so-called erroneous reading of the Septuagint, however, is now supported and confirmed by manuscript 967, which is one of the earliest manuscripts of the Septuagint we possess. If error it be, then it may well have been introduced on purpose by the translator himself. It is not to be corrected in an edition of the text of the Septuagint," end quote. So, as I said, he's a proponent of that reading. He believes that is the correct reading of the Septuagint. And that's why he's saying and he has error in it in quotations, if it's a quote-unquote error, then it may very well be the original translator of the Septuagint introduced this quote-unquote error. And John is picking up this reading of the Septuagint, again, just not to be too repetitive, if he is in fact getting this from a version and not just linking it himself. Which, because John was such an expert of the Old Testament and because he references the Old Testament so often, I think he did get Revelation 13 and 14. I think he did get this linkage from those Septuagint manuscripts. That's my view. But not to say that he introduced any errors, quote-unquote errors, but that John, under inspiration, authenticated those readings of the Septuagint as communicating truth. So that's where I'm currently at on it. Lust has another comment on this. He says, quote, the Septuagint wishes to identify the Son of Man with the Ancient of Days. Since the latter is God, it thus presents him as riding on the clouds being known as a vehicle of the gods, end quote. So there he's just commenting on the idea of the cloud rider. We've discussed that in multiple videos. I have one called Jesus is Yahweh the Cloud Rider. We've discussed this cloud rider idea multiple times, but on the channel, and it is here in Revelation. We actually discussed it earlier. There was trying to remember what the title of that was. I think it was called the Cloud Rider and the Pierced God, or the Pierced God and the Cloud Rider, something like that, where we discussed the Cloud Rider in that one also. So it's interesting that Lust brings that in as well. Something else I thought was very interesting in light of this whole discussion about the two powers and identifying the one like a Son of Man as the Ancient of Days, is that some of the early church fathers believed the Ancient of Days was Christ. And you can find that in their writings. For example, Saint Cyril of Alexandria and Saint John of Damascus. And those are two big names in the early church, especially for the Orthodox, Saint John of Damascus. So for those early fathers to equate Christ with the Ancient of Days, I thought was interesting. So, yeah, okay, so let's just keep going here. If you read scholarship on this, there are scholars who hold to a lower Christology than I do, and they point out that Jesus is also here described using angelic terms. Now that specifically comes from Daniel chapter 10, which, as I said, we'll focus on more in our next study on verses 13 and 14. But one of the main issues that comes up in Daniel chapter 10 is trying to identify how many different individuals are present in the text. So I think, and we're not going to get derailed here on a study of Daniel. Lord willing, we'll go through the book of Daniel in detail, just like we're doing for Revelation in the future, and we'll of course get into it there. So setting aside the issue of trying to identify all the different individuals present in Daniel 10, I will just mention that I personally think that Daniel 10, 5 and 6 is describing the second power in heaven, the pre-incarnate Christ. Now, some scholars have a problem with that because later on in Daniel chapter 10, the angel that's talking with Daniel says that he was trapped by the prince of Persia, and Michael had to come and help him. So the scholars who believe that the being described in Daniel 10, the early verses, is the same as the being in verse 10 and onward, they have a problem seeing Christ there, because there's no way that the second power in heaven, that God would have to have Michael help him with the prince of Persia. And I definitely agree with that if it's the same being throughout Daniel chapter 10, then it would not be the pre-incarnate Christ. But I am with, and I think it's a minority position. I did see in Paul Tanner's commentary on Daniel, it's a really, really good commentary put out by Lexham. It's pretty darn new. I can't remember the year, but it's really relatively new. He does not think that the individual described in Daniel 10, 5 and 6 is the same as the individual described in Daniel 10, 11 and onward. And that has been my personal view for a number of years, probably like a decade. So it was cool to see Tanner held a similar view to myself. But with all that being said, it's actually more talk about Daniel 10 than I was intending to do right here. If we set aside that issue, we still have the Septuagint of Isaiah 9, verse 6 and 7, which says, "For a child is born to us, and a son is given to us, whose government is upon his shoulder." And if you're reading in the Masoretic text, the English will say something like, "His name is called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Prince of Peace, Everlasting Father," something like that. Well, the Septuagint says his name is called the Messenger of the Great Council, or the Messenger of Great Council, or the Angel of the Great Council, something like that. So this one in Daniel 10 or Isaiah 9 being described using angelic language is the same and fits with the angel of Yahweh, who is the second power in heaven. This is Jacob's exact statement in Genesis 48. God, and the angel, he, singular. So it's, again, the basis of this idea of two powers, what became Trinitarian doctrine. So if the angel language, if you're hung up with the identification of who is described in the early verses of Daniel 10, I guess this is what it comes down to. If that's a hang up of seeing this individual in Daniel 10, noticing, as scholars do, that he is described using the same, that John describes Jesus using that same language. So if that's a hang up, it doesn't need to be. I don't think it should be, because there are scholars such as Paul Tanner who believe that there are other individuals present in Daniel 10 in addition to the angel that talks to Daniel at the end of that chapter. And that's also my view. So, again, if this angelic language is a hang-up, I don't think it should be, because the angel, the messenger, the Lord of the council is the second power in heaven, who is also Yahweh, the Ancient of Days. So we don't need to get hung up on the angelic language, I don't believe. So verse 14, his head and hair were as white as wool, even as white as snow, and his eyes were like a fiery flame. So this is the descriptors of the Ancient of Days in Daniel 7. So I'm going to go ahead and read it again. I know I already read it before, but I'm going to read it again. And this time I'm going to read it with P967 in place of the Masoretic. So Daniel 7, verse 9 and 13. While I was watching, thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His attire was white like snow. The hair of his head was like lamb's wool. His throne was ablaze with fire, and its wheels were all aflame. I was observing in a vision of the night, and behold, upon the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And as the Ancient of Days he came, and the bystanders approached him. So what we see here is Jesus called one like a son of man, or a human one, and he's described as the Ancient of Days is described. The Ancient of Days is God Most High. So John is equating Jesus with God Most High. And I have a video on the channel titled Yahweh and El Elyon, where I go into the Most High language, Elyon. John could also be there could also be a reference here to 1 Enoch, a couple passages out of 1 Enoch. So 1 Enoch 71 verse 10 says, and with them the head of days, his head white and pure as wool, and his raiment indescribable. So that's very similar. The pure wool, the head being white, and being described as the head of days, which would be a synonym for Ancient of Days. And also Enoch 41 verse 1 says, at that place I saw the one to whom belongs the time before time, and his head was white like wool, and with him there was another whose face had the appearance of a man, and his face was full of grace like one of the holy angels. So there is some issues with the book of Enoch. Scholars debate it heavily, of course. It's referred to very often. It's very popular. What's called the similitudes of Enoch. Enoch sees this one like the Son of Man. Now the issue is that it sure seems like in the latter part of the similitudes of Enoch, Enoch himself is identified as the Son of Man. Now that is disputed by some scholars. They don't think so, but to my knowledge, the majority view is that Enoch is described as the Son of Man in the book of Enoch. So my thought, and this is unique to me, I have not come across this in any scholarship. So my thought here is that when Jesus is going around referring to himself as the Son of Man, we often immediately think of either Daniel 7 or Ezekiel. But the similitudes of Enoch would have been, scholars believe, would have been written either just before or right around the time of Jesus' birth and ministry. So it would have been popular circulating at the time. So my thought is that Jesus, when he's using that phrase, is issuing a polemic on the book of Enoch, the similitudes of Enoch. He's making it clear that it's Jesus, not Enoch, who is the true Son of Man. It's Jesus, not Enoch, who is the second power in heaven. It's Jesus who is the Ancient of Days, the cloud rider, the voice. So if that is the case, if John does have any kind of 1 Enoch 41 in mind here, it could be in a similar sense that, yes, I'm describing the Ancient of Days using Daniel language and using Enoch language, but as John makes it very clear, it's not Enoch that we're talking about here as this one like a son of man. It's Jesus. It's the exalted Christ. So that's just my own idea about Jesus using that term. So as I continue studying and reading things, we'll see if any other scholars think that. So verse 15, Revelation 1:15 says, his feet were like polished bronze refined in a furnace, and his voice was like the roar of many waters. So verse 14, Jesus is described as the Ancient of Days, and here in verse 15, he's described as the divine man. And you might think, what in the world does verse 15 have with the divine man? It just said his feet were like polished bronze refined in a furnace, and his voice was like the roar of many waters. Well, you could be linking it to the voice, and if so, you'd be correct. But at the very start, his feet were like polished bronze. Interestingly, in this period, Roman artwork that depicted the subject as barefoot indicated that individual being depicted was divine, or in the sphere of the divine. So John, of course, being alive during this Roman period, he would have known that the artwork that the Roman artwork, if the subject is barefoot, then that subject is divine. So John here presents Jesus, his feet, he describes the feet, specifically mentions the feet. Why? Because the feet being mentioned points to the divinity, which is interesting. And this also links back to, surprise, the Old Testament, Exodus chapter 24. Exodus 24, 9 and 10, where Moses, Aaron, and the elders of Israel saw the feet of the God of Israel. So the feet of God were seen in Exodus 24. John specifically describes the feet of Jesus here. And the Romans at the time would have been familiar with artwork depicting the barefooted individual as divine. I think we also have to go back once again to Ezekiel chapter 1, which I feel like we've spent just as much time in Ezekiel chapter 1 lately as we have anywhere else, but I'm going to read it again here because we have this reference to the voice again. So Ezekiel 1, 27 and 28, Ezekiel says, I saw an amber glow like fire enclosed all around him from his waist up. And this is where Ezekiel is describing the human one who is the likeness of Yahweh's glory seated on this throne. So Ezekiel says, from his waist down, I saw something that looked like fire. There was a brilliant light around it, like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds after the rain. This was the appearance of the surrounding brilliant light. It looked like the glory of Yahweh. When I saw it, I threw myself face down, and I heard a voice speaking. So there we go again with the voice. And as we mentioned in our study of the voice, this voice is similar to Ezekiel 43 verse 2, where Ezekiel says, and behold, the glory of the God of Israel came from the way of the east, and his voice was like a noise of many waters, and the earth shined with his glory. So in this passage, the glory is approaching the temple in Ezekiel 43. And the rabbis said the voice was uttered from inside the temple. And Beale comments on this here, and he says, quote, the Son of Man's voice is also set in a heavenly temple context, which underscores further Christ's divine attributes, end quote. And he's specifically linking that with verse 12 and verse 16, verse 12 being the lampstands, and then verse 16, which we'll talk about in a future study. So what we have here, once again, is the voice of Christ being equated with the voice of God. As we discussed the importance of the voice as deity marker in an earlier study, as I mentioned before, and even in that study, I mentioned that this would come up again in verse 15, and this is where it does come up. So with that, I'm going to end this teaching, and in our next teaching, we'll go through this same passage again, as I said, focusing on more of the clothing and the eyes of fire and what the feet, we mentioned the feet, I mentioned the feet here, but in our next study, we'll go through what is the significance of the fact that they're polished bronze refined in a furnace and those type of things. So that will be the subject of our next study. I want to thank you all for listening. God bless. I'll talk to you all very soon.